when things have learned to walk that ought to crawl.
Unfortunately, this story may be rather short, as I only got a glance at it. Additionally, this happened only about 20 minutes ago, so I'm still shaken up by it. Regardless, I'm a student at Auburn University. I was on the phone with someone, venting about why business majors need to learn calculus. Since me and her kept talking, I decided to not go straight back to my apartment, and instead drove down a country road while we kept conversing. The road is mostly surrounded by trees with some sparse houses and the occasional gas station or other business sprinkled along one side of the road. I knew I needed to get back to my apartment to keep studying, so after 4 or so miles, I turned around and was headed back. A few minutes later, still driving down the same road, and in a stretch with some buildings with their lights on to my driver's side, I glanced at my passenger side window and saw a pale, humanoid body leap out of a tree and land in the ditch to the right of my truck. It was rainy and dark, so I couldn't see entirely clearly, but there was enough illumination from a light on in a parking lot to make out human-like arms, legs, and just how white its skin was. It looked like it was curled up in a ball as well, which doesn't make sense why it would be doing that while jumping, but I know I could make out the clear silhouette of arms, legs, and I could tell that it was human-sized. I immediately pushed on the brakes to see if I could get a better look, and I swear I saw the red brake light glinting off the white skin as it moved along the ditch to the opposite direction from me and back towards the tree line. It was like I stopped thinking as what I just saw registered with me and the shock hit me. I looked in the mirror and my face was as pale as the thing's skin. The girl I was talking to had continued talking during all this, as she didn't have any idea that this happened, and I realized that I'd responded to the last few things she said with sure or other short responses like that. I thought about telling her what I saw, but I decided against it, as I didn't want to sound insane. I drove back to my apartment and told one of my roommates about it, who also is interested in things like this. He believed me, and we ended up joking about it a bit, which calmed me down. Sorry if this isn't the most descriptive or best written post. I think I'm still shocked at what I saw, but I wanted to see if y'all think there's any reasonable explanation or if it's what I think it is. What freaks me out even more is that I was on this subreddit earlier today. I've always been interested in stuff like this, and I stumbled across a comment where a guy said that his brother also had a possible sighting in Auburn as well. Please, let me know what y'all think. I work on a horse farm, and tonight while I was feeding my horse, I noticed they were all spooking at something on the other side of the farm. My boyfriend kept saying there was a person on the other side of the farm. I thought he was seeing a tree that looked like a person until he pointed at where it was, and it looked like an unnecessarily tall person, and it started to move. I still thought it was a tree until we got to that side, and the donkeys that were put over there because of coyotes were acting scared, and they aren't normally scared. That's when I heard something in the woods, and we pointed the headlight over. My boyfriend grabbed his shotgun because we both thought it was a person, and then it sounded like it was running away, so I wasn't as concerned anymore. Until we saw one on the property next to the farm, and it wasn't a person. There's no way it was a person, but that's not what scared the both of us the most. It was when I was closing the gate and locking up that whatever was out there started running at me, and I ran to the car. When we got to the main road, it stopped chasing us. We looked back, and it was roughly 8 feet tall, and just standing in the middle of the road. I don't know what I saw, but I do know it wasn't a person. I don't know if what I saw was a crawler, but I would like to know if it was, and if they're going to cause issues out at the farm. Update. My boyfriend got to the main gate this time to see if it would chase him or if it was just going to chase me. And it chased him and chased his car down the road for a little bit. Probably should mention that he was cussing at it and probably made it mad. I've looked at some of the other stories and pictures on this sub, and I'm pretty sure that this is what we are dealing with. I had this encounter about a year ago, but I started thinking about it quite a bit recently. So I made an account just to post this, so please do tell me your thoughts about this. I had decided to go on a solo hiking trip for about 2 weeks. This would have been my second time doing something like this. The first 2 days of the hike were very average and relaxing, just a simple hike. But at night, things got a little bit weird. I went to sleep at around 9 or 10 p.m. and nothing much happened until around 2 a.m. I remember smelling a faint stench of rotting meat. It wasn't anything too crazy, but it was weird enough to somewhat wake me up. I tried to ignore it and go back to sleep, but then I started to notice that something was moving around my tent. I did think that, because of the smell and the sounds, that it could be some carnivorous animal that maybe stank of rotting meat for whatever reason. But since I was half asleep, I wanted to make sure it's not a bear or something, so I opened my eyes to check around. Now, just to note that during the night, the moon was quite bright, so it was possible to see quite well outside. So when I opened my eyes, I could see a vague, lanky, humanoid shadow outside my tent. I didn't feel like I was in danger or anything. I did have a sidearm with me, so even if it was some creep, I didn't really feel threatened while holding a gun. After about a minute, the guy left, and the smell also disappeared. But since it was a very creepy encounter, I stayed awake for about an hour, and nothing else happened. And after nothing else happened, I went back to bed. The next day I had that weird feeling of being watched by something dangerous. But I don't know if it was because I was confident in my ability to protect myself or whatever, but I didn't feel like I was in any danger at all. I just felt creeped out. I didn't really enjoy that day all that much, to be fully honest, and because of that, I set up camp a lot faster than I usually did, but didn't go to bed at my normal time, since I didn't want someone sneaking up on me again. At around 1 a.m., I could smell that weird smell again, so I gripped my gun a little bit tighter and tried to find the guy. But instead, all I saw were just a pair of yellowish eyes in the distance. I stared at them for about 5 minutes, and then they just vanished, together with the smell. I didn't feel like I was being watched anymore during that night, so after an hour, I did decide to go to sleep. The next day, the feeling of being watched was back, but again, I didn't feel as though I was in any danger at all. But I decided that even though I felt that way, I would still rather cut this trip short instead of actually getting into a situation where I am in danger, so I started making my way back. Though, through a more roundabout path. Nothing really happened that night. The next day I suddenly could smell that rotten stench. It wasn't any stronger than before, but since I was in a decently large clearing at that time and didn't see anyone or anything around me, I did panic a little bit and started walking with a faster pace. I'm not exactly sure on how long I walked after that, but around midday, the stench got stronger. Now, I think it's important to note that I don't have the best vision and should wear glasses, but I don't most of the time, so when I looked around me and saw a grey humanoid figure quite far away to my left, I did panic. But by the time I put my glasses on, it was gone. After that, I really didn't feel like staying there for much longer, so I started doing a slow run to get out of there faster. I'd run quite a distance while feeling something following me, but then I ran into this strangely peaceful clearing where both the stench and the feeling of being watched stopped. It was a relatively small clearing with a few small boulders around. But the strange thing was that a man who was in his late 40s or maybe even early 50s was sitting on one of the boulders. He was wearing very plain dad clothes, definitely not something you would be wearing while hiking in the middle of nowhere. Plus, he had no gear anywhere near him. But the thing that I noticed first about that guy was his strangely bright green eyes. They weren't bright in a literal sense, but more like the kind of brightness you would see in the eyes of a child. After running for so long, I was exhausted, and the man noticed that and told me to sit down on one of the boulders and rest. I didn't even think about it and sat down. We talked for a bit, mostly about hiking and nature, and while talking, he had this very friendly smile that made me feel at ease. When I had rested, he offered to help me build my campsite in the clearing. He was very good at starting a fire. We shared a cup of tea, and he told me that it was very nice talking to me, but he has to go now. He didn't really say why or where he has to go, but he just stood up and left. That night, I didn't hear any noises other than a few birds and crickets. When I woke up the next day, I felt very refreshed. I packed up and started to continue along the trail. I didn't feel like I was being watched or smelled that stench at all during the rest of my hike. Well then, this was the first time I've told this story in full detail. I usually say that some animal or whatever was following me, since that way people would actually believe me. But I decided to actually write exactly what happened. I also wanted to apologize for the long post and my English. I'm not a native English speaker, so please do correct me if I made any grammatical mistakes. And please, do share your thoughts on this. Okay, for starters, I did not believe any of this was real until after midnight last night. I believed everyone was just making things up and having communities like this to be a part of for shits and giggles. However, last night I saw something I could not and still cannot explain. I live in Newnan, Georgia. My house is very rural and surrounded by woods on all sides and all farms on my side of town. I do not know much about flesh pedestrians other than the mainstream stuff going around. Did not believe it was real. Met with my girlfriend about it all the time to scare her as jokes. Frequently mentioned their actual name. However, I got back to my house around 2 a.m. last night. I was on FaceTime with my girlfriend while I was driving home. However, upon arriving, and on about 80% battery I might add, my phone shut off and would not work. I didn't think anything of it. I get out of my truck and my dogs started going crazy, barking and growling loud. They only bark at people they don't know, as they are livestock guardians and don't pay animals they don't see as threats any mind. Anyways, while they are barking, I hear what sounds like fake barking close behind me. Almost like a person trying to sound like a dog bark. But if that person had never tried and was just shitty at it, it made my hair stand up because I had assumed it was a person in the woods behind me. I turned towards the sound and see nothing. The sound happens again, and when I look into the direction, I saw a creature I'll never forget. It was hunched on all fours, grey humanish face, large dark black eyes that reflected bright when the light was shined on it. No mouth, human-like body but with patches of fur throughout. Fur not covering body. Do not know any more details because as soon as I looked it in the eyes, it bolted towards me. I jumped in my truck and bolted. No more chasing. I called my grandmother, who lives through the woods, to give me an extra set of eyes so I know I'm not crazy. She, who has always been adamant that nothing exists paranormally, said she had been worked up by my dogs barking through the woods and a very high-pitched scream that sounded human and animal-like. We sat in the driveway and half-heartedly looked through the woods in the direction of the sighting. We began to hear a grunting in a different point in the woods. Loud grunting, kind of like a deer in rut. We turned to listen, and then it started behind us. Then, the scream she had heard before was changing directions around us, when we would turn to hear it every time. Could not sleep after going inside. Locked all the windows and doors. Heard it tapping and knocking on my bedroom for about an hour. After falling asleep, I had recurring nightmares of that being watching me and hunting me from different places. Please help me ID. Sounds like a Navajo skinwalker, but I live nowhere near their land, nor do I know any Navajo. I myself am part Cherokee and Creek, but only about 15%. No native ritual land I am on that I know of. I've never been skittish. My girlfriend routinely has to tell me not to go look in the woods by myself after hearing sounds. But after these sounds and what I saw, I will no longer be going outside at night. So this takes place in the Sacramento, California area. It was about 2 years ago now. It was winter, nighttime, around 2 a.m. I had just gotten off work but wasn't ready to go home, so I pulled over on the side of the road before turning into my neighborhood. On this street, there's a suburban neighborhood to the right and fields and trees to the left. As I was sitting there, I saw a figure come out of the neighborhood, a little less than a quarter of a mile ahead of where I was parked. Approximately where the neighborhood park is. It was hard to see from that distance, but it appeared tall, 7 to 8 feet, super skinny and bony, hunched over with long arms. It sprinted across the road at a speed faster than I've ever seen a human go. I couldn't guess the speed, but it was fast enough to concern me. If it wasn't for its speed, I probably would have just assumed it was a human and ignored it. But anyways, it disappeared into the fields. Something calm came over me. I don't know what it was, but something was keeping me from panicking. I remember just feeling like, okay, it is time to leave now, and calmly driving home. It wasn't until a few months later that I realized I had seen that, and that it wasn't normal. Flash forward to a week ago. A friend and I were at the same park, doing some spells. We're witches. As it got later into the night, we both started to feel more and more unwelcome there. As I was finishing up my spell, we heard an inhuman, guttural scream that sounded like it came from the area I saw that creature cross at. That's not particularly incriminating, but as soon as I heard the scream, its apparent location made me think of the creature. I didn't tell this to my friend as she is easily spooked, and I just tried to calmly finish up my spell. Didn't want to let my fear get out of control when doing spell work. We finally finished up and packed up and started the trek back to the car. As we left, we faced a dark area with lots of bushes and trees across from the sidewalk we were taking to get to the car. As soon as I faced that dark spot, I had the feeling of looking at a face. I didn't literally see a face, but it was the feeling of seeing a face. And it didn't feel like a human face. It felt like something that understood what I was, but didn't understand why I was there. It wasn't quite hostile, but had the attitude of, get out of my home. Once again, I didn't tell my friend that I saw that. Not until we got into the car. Ever since then, I have not been able to shake the feeling that that face belonged to the same creature I saw 2 years ago. What do you all think? Also, similar story but not the same. Last night, I was driving in a wooded area near Sac, and I saw a tall, burly figure in the woods with a white face. Not white as in Caucasian, white as in stark white. I thought it was wearing a green t-shirt, but I only saw it for a split second. It gave me such a bad, uneasy feeling that I started putting protection sigils on my windows. I told the guy I was with what I saw, and he didn't tell me until later, but he said he's heard rumors of people seeing white walkers in these woods that are described as tall and having white faces and black hair. I don't know if he meant skinwalkers or what, but that's what he said. I also felt like something was watching me in those woods later. Any input is appreciated. This is my kid's story, but I'm inclined to believe him. I just don't know what to make of it either. We live in a rural area, dead-end road. We walk it daily, so we're very familiar with the scenery and the neighbours' habits. He likes to look at the stars, so he went out for his last walk around 9 p.m. Came in out of breath. I thought maybe he heard coyotes and they spooked him. He said he was walking past a group of trees when he thought he saw movement. So he shined a flashlight that way and saw a grey face peeking at him from behind one of the trees. After Googling it, he showed me a picture of a rake and said it looked similar, but smaller eyes that reflected green. He thought at first it was a deer, but he couldn't see the rest of the body as he walked, and it didn't move, just kept watching. He said he walked as calmly as he could and watched it from the corner of his eye for as long as he could see it discreetly. And as soon as he got to our immediate neighbor's house, he ran. I wanted to call it a deer, but those trees have no tall brush around them, and 3 to 4 feet or so between each tree. You could easily tell if a deer was standing there. And the group of trees are roughly 10 yards from the road, so near enough to see clearly given the heavy-duty flashlight he takes. We went out tonight to see if we could see it, but nothing. Not that I wanted to, but he insisted. He needed to stumble upon it again with a witness for validation. I'm more live and let live. You stay out there and I'll stay in here. But it's really bothering him, and things have been strange around here lately. So, any ideas? A little detail first. I live in the Ozark Mountains. I have about 63 acres of land on a mountain, and I'm about 20 minutes from both towns near me. My house was originally a cabin built in the 1800s that someone had built onto. I don't have much more knowledge of the house because all the paperwork burned in a courthouse fire. Weird shit has always happened in and around the house, but those are stories for a different time. Last year, around February, I had a huge argument with my husband and decided to go hike up in the mountain to cool off. My husband went to work on his Jeep, and my 5 dogs and I went up the mountain. Normally my dogs run around through the trees, but they always keep me in their sights. This time, they stuck very close to me. I noted it and just assumed it was because they knew how upset I was. We made it to the clearing, and it just seemed so still up there. I felt a little uneasy, but ignored it and climbed up our deer stand. I sat up there for about 20 minutes, took some pictures, and I looked down to see my dogs at the base of the tree, standing in different directions in alert stances. The feeling of dread washed over me. I scrambled down the deer stand and walked across the clearing with the dogs in tow. I did not want to run because we have predators. All of a sudden, I could hear loud whistling. I stopped in my tracks. My dogs are now on high alert and all staring behind me to the left. My husband's voice came from that direction. He was screaming my name like something was wrong. I cannot describe the fear that came over me. I continued to walk down the mountain and walked over to my husband and asked him what was wrong. He looked at me confused and told me he had no idea what I was talking about. I kind of forgot about this moment until today. I woke up to a loud whistling outside of my house, around 4:40 to 5 a.m. It was the same whistle I used to call my dogs home. Parts of the whistle were wrong. All of my dogs were inside and my husband was still asleep. Part of me told myself to go check it out, but a voice in my head said to stay in bed. I listened to the voice. Update. We are okay. These past days have been quiet. Our 2 male dogs have refused to go inside except to eat. They've been guarding the house. This happened to me late August when I was driving down from Washington to San Diego with some friends. The 3 of us were camping in cool spots along the way, and at one point during our trip, we stopped to camp for a night near the Sierra Nevada mountains. My friend had heard that the sunrise's reflection over the mountains is beautiful, so we decided to wake up around 5 a.m. the next morning to watch. That time came and we reluctantly left our tent and walked about 10 minutes from our pretty remote campsite over to a long road and stretch of desert with a great view of the mountains. We stood there for about 20 minutes. Then, as I was looking across the distance, something caught my eye. It seemed to be some type of animal, but a weird size and super white. At first, I thought it was a bunny, but then decided that there was no way, as it was way too large for that. The figure was maybe the size of a large dog, bright white, and moved in kind of an unnatural way, like jerky and fast. I remember the face being really weird, kind of indescribable. It gave me goosebumps as I stared at it, trying to figure out what I was seeing. I looked over to my friends and asked them if they were seeing the thing that I had described. When I looked back, I couldn't see it anymore. Neither of my friends had seen this figure, but they shared a look, and one of them did a motion like 2 fingers walking on his arm. The other nodded, and they told me they didn't know what it was, but we should go back to our campsite. After that experience, I asked them what they weren't telling me a bunch of times. I kind of thought they were playing a joke on me, but I was still persistent with my questions. They told me to drop it until we made it to San Diego and promised they would explain it when we got there. A few days later, as we drove into San Diego late at night, I brought it up again. That's when I learned about the Skinwalker for the first time. They told me that they've read stories that sound exactly like what I saw, and noted how weird it was that I described the figure like that without ever having heard of the Skinwalker before. I was so freaked out, and I was glad they waited to tell me. They told me that they waited to share because they didn't want to risk anything by thinking or talking about it. I'm not sure if I saw the Skinwalker that day, or if maybe my tired eyes were playing tricks on me. I'm just definitely not eager to return to the area anytime soon. So, I was chilling at home and my other friends were out hiking. I wasn't invited because I had college courses that day, but when they came back, they recited an experience to me. So my friends, including my best friend Brandon, were hiking around the Cherokee National Park, and before they knew it, the sun had set. Brandon was trying to get down to a second part of their trail faster, and he slid down the side of a hill. Little did he know his pocket ripped, and his phone fell out of his pocket. He didn't know until about 15 minutes later when he went to text somebody and didn't find it. They were already back where they were at this point, but they used SnapMap to see where his phone was. He ran back to get it and picked it up. He placed it securely in an unripped pocket until he heard a blood-curdling scream. He's had similar experiences, but not this close. At first, he thought it was a mountain lion, until they distinctly yelled, "Help! Over here!" He walked up the incline and looked between the trees to see where the sound was coming from. And across the way, he saw a man standing on a neighboring mountain. The screams stopped, and he just stared over at Brandon, an unmoving silhouette. This continued for a few seconds before Brandon's fight or flight suddenly kicked in, and he went with it and just started running as fast as he could back to the meeting grounds. He looked back once and recited to me that the eyes of whatever was chasing him were reflective and too big to be a mountain lion of sorts. He ran for about 8 minutes, and then he ran into 2 other friends that were on the trip, Caleb and Alex, and they were like, "Dude, what's wrong?" Brandon wastes no time explaining and just tells them, "Just fucking run." And so they did. They ran for another 10 minutes. All the while, the 3 of them exclaimed that they kept hearing screams, all in different tones of voices, male, female, etc. They finally got back, still feeling the chasing, and urged everybody to just get in the car. After that, they sped off and didn't look back. They still haven't gone back. To me, this sounds like a Skinwalker encounter, but what do you all think? Because I know since they're Navajo creatures, they mostly reside in the Midwest areas. But I just don't know what else this could have been. We're in East Tennessee. I live the furthest out from all my friends, 25 minutes from the nearest town, and walking distance from the Cherokee Park border. I was responding to a call in the middle of the Mojave Desert around 10 p.m. on a lonely road that leads to Pahrump, Nevada. As I was driving, I see to my left a human-like figure running through the desert. The man-shaped creature was all black and appeared to be running like 30 miles per hour. I turned on my lights and pointed in that direction, but it vanished. I freaked out a bit, called my girl, and told myself I'm new to the area. I'm probably just afraid and tripping out. I handled my call and forget it happened. 2 weeks later, I responded to a call with my partner, who was driving his own patrol car. My partner arrested a guy in a car, so I waited with the suspect car until the tow truck driver arrived. I sat in my car in the darkness. No biggie. I see the tow truck driver in the distance, headed my way. As he arrives, the tow driver immediately comes to my car and says, "Are you alright?" I say I'm fine, and he says, "I wanted to come check on you because I just saw a man running away from your car." I say, "Shut up, bro." He says, "Yeah, it looked like a tall man wearing all black running full speed away from your car." I tell him to get into my car, and he and I go search for the guy, but don't see anything. At this point, I go back to the office and share my experience. They think I'm crazy. A few weeks go by. I'm on a call of a traffic collision with parties ejected. After clearing the scene, I walk back to my car. I hear some screams for help near my car. I start to yell, "Where are you?" and point my flashlight. I see nothing. A partner who is near me also hears them. We both go searching, but the screams stop. Never found anything. Everything I'm recounting in the story here is 100% true. I'm not going to try to persuade everyone that this is for certain a skinwalker or anything, but this creeped everyone involved in this story out, including me, a pretty big skeptic when it comes to this sort of thing. I'd also like to apologize for the length of this story in advance, as there's a lot that needs to be mentioned to set the scene. Here it goes. It all starts when a couple of friends and I, who I will refer to as Q, R, and S, wanted to have a guy's vacation and go camping somewhere back in May 2021. As a little backstory, Q was my best friend, and S was R's younger brother. We chose a spot that we had been to once before, but when we got there, we decided to drive out another 3-ish miles away from the previous destination. The area wasn't extremely in the middle of nowhere, as some of you might think. There was a dirt road wide enough for a decent-sized truck to go up and down the road with ease. Once we decided on a place to camp, we realized that not a soul was in the general area for probably another mile. The only evidence that there was anyone near us was the distant sound of gunshots, as the shooting was allowed in this area at the time. The only things alive in the area that we could see were larger than a bird, were the grazing cattle, caged in by a fence. One of the main activities we would be participating in was trapping coyotes. For those of you who don't know, coyotes don't require a tag to kill, and you can hunt as many as you want, as they are extremely quick to reproduce. We set up the traps about 500 yards away from our campsite in a valley that a creek was running through. We could tell that this was a bottleneck for the coyotes to travel through, as many game trails were coming down to this checkpoint, and we were certain at least one coyote would come through. We set up the traps and then headed back to our campsite. We got back and the sun is beginning to set. Being the middle of May, the sun was out in full force where we were at, approaching 100 degrees Fahrenheit. We were already exhausted from hauling around the heavy trapping gear, but this heat was just making it worse. It got to the point where the only thing we could do was sit in what little shade we had and wait for a couple of hours until the sun was down. A few hours later, the sun finally sets and the temperature begins to drop. We search around with our flashlights to find any dry sticks and dead sagebrush in the ground, all with the cows mooing in the background. Once we get our fire lit, we sit around and are laughing, reminiscing on old times, and just being happy to be around each other. A few minutes go by, and we're all just sitting around the campfire in silence, when we hear a strange, high-pitched whine. I remember S asking R what the sound was, and R tells him it was probably a coyote or something. The sound keeps persisting, and whatever was making it was getting closer to the campfire. Every 10 or so seconds, the creature would call out. We went from laughing at it to just being confused the more we heard it, and the closer it got. Then, when we hear the thing call once again, probably around 40 feet or so in front of me, it's silent for only about 5 seconds this time. And not even kidding, we heard the same call, but this time from only like 20 feet behind me. This might not sound scary to a lot of you, but at that moment, it was chilling. We all scrambled up and we were feeling paranoid. So R assembles his .22 that he brought with us. Then out of nowhere, the creature is back to where it once was, about 40 or so feet in front of me again. We're all spooked and confused on how this is even happening. While Q, R, and S are talking, I pull out my phone, tell them to shut up, and try to record the sound that this thing is making. We all decide to try to follow that noise and see if we can find anything. It seemed to be leading us somewhere, but we weren't sure. As we followed, the thing was keeping a good distance between us, no less than 40 feet at a time. We crossed the cow fence, which was quite the task because it was coated in barbed wire. It's a bit strange too because that creature crossed through it without any sound. It kept pointing us in a direction that was leading to another creek. But as soon as we got there, we heard it from about 50 feet up a hill, which no animal could have done in that short of a time without making any noise. We got shaken up by the whole thing, so we just went back to our tent. As soon as we got up, however, Q pulled me aside and mentioned that he thought he saw something duck down when he shined his light at the hill the creature was leading us to. Throughout the night, we kept hearing that thing circling our tent, making those whining noises the entire time. We ended up spending another night there with the same things happening, but no harm came to us. The whole thing was just super unsettling. We didn't end up catching anything on that trip either. Now, before any of you ask, I'm going to clarify some things. This took place in southeastern Tooele County, Utah. The place we stayed was near a small town called Vernon. We're almost certain it wasn't a cow. Cows are loud, clumsy creatures. I mention this because none of us heard any movement, and even the baby cows can't move that high. At least, not from the ones that we heard. Also, how could it have crossed that fence? They had also gone around the hill to a different side of the owner's property. We were completely sober during the entire campout. None of us had even done drugs or drank. Maybe the heat exhaustion could have had a hand in it. We were able to find some coyote tracks, but we weren't sure if they were there before or after that night. Also, they were quite the distance away from our campsite, and they seemed to be going in completely the opposite direction from where the creature was taking us. So we ruled that out. I didn't record the descent into the valley because I got caught up in the moment. I wasn't thinking about much other than trying to figure out what that creature was. Also, my phone was very close to dying. It was most likely a coyote. That's what we thought at first, but coyotes don't sound like that. They also usually travel in packs and are extremely loud. They sound more like high-pitched dog barks. There is a chance it was a bird, but that's a theory that I'm trying to tell myself. It's just strange though, because no other birds were out that night. We are fairly certain it was just one creature, but the truth is we don't know for sure. But I am going to assume that there was just one because the sound never played at the same time from two different areas. Also, when we heard it from directly behind me, it never came from there again, only straight in front of me, leading us to that creek and beyond. I'm very skeptical it was some kind of a skinwalker, but I honestly have no clue anymore. I did a little research on the area we stayed a few months after the whole ordeal. The area we were camping at was old Goshute territory, before the Spaniards came back in the 1600s. I looked and there were hardly any Goshute legends that I could piece to something like this. I've been trying to do some research but haven't found anything like this. Does anyone have any ideas on what this could have been? A few months back, I was staying the night at my friend's house. He lives on the far edge of a town in Utah. He still had neighbors around, but there was a lot of forest around, and it was next to a canyon. I don't know if the scenery helps to the story, but I will try to list every detail of my encounter. I was staying the night, and my girlfriend also came over to hang out for a while. We hang out, and everything is fine and fun and great. 1 a.m. rolls around, and I had work at 6 a.m. in another town about 30 minutes away. So I said, hey, maybe you should leave so I can get some sleep before work. And at this time, my friend went to sleep and it was just me and her. As we were walking to her car, I started feeling uneasy, like I could hear something. We get to the driver's side of her car and I give her a hug goodbye. As I'm hugging my girlfriend, I look behind her and am struck with shock and fear as I see a creature maybe 8 to 9 feet tall. It was standing next to a cherry tree on the side of my friend's driveway. It was bipedal and very skinny. The moon was out, so I could see the creature clearly, but not so much the color details. The legs were bent backwards like a deer legs, or like the back moose legs. It slouched a lot, and I still couldn't see its face as it was in the leaves of the cherry tree, which has to be around 11 to 12 feet tall. I remember not being able to talk much except goodbye to my girlfriend. I don't know why, but I couldn't tell her to look behind her. Before I let go of her, though, I saw the creature move. It took off running towards the tree line. What absolutely baffled my mind was the speed of the creature. It looked impossible, as if it was blurry when it started running. I remember it looking right at me through the leaves, even though I couldn't see its face. What was the worst thing about the experience was the emotions attached to seeing what I saw. I felt like my confidence and emotions were attacked. I've never felt the feeling of fear like this before, and I have been charged by full-grown brown bears. After my girlfriend got into her car, I stood in that very spot from when I hugged her until she left the driveway. I don't know if it was more out of fear or just making sure she left safely. I didn't know what to do, so I slowly walked over to my car and got in. I called my friend multiple times, and he was asleep and didn't answer. I looked out my window after several minutes and looked to the left and saw my friend's cat, Avery. And I tried to think logically. If my friend's cat, which probably has better senses than me, is out here, then I am probably seeing things and it was safe. So I got out and stood next to Avery. Next thing I know, it sounds like there's a Clydesdale horse running through deep growth of the forest. Avery started running for the door, and I sprinted faster than Avery and got inside. For the next 3 hours, I sobbed and cried like I did when my dog died when I was 12. The fear I felt was indescribably powerful. I also remember it had long arms, and when it ran, it used all limbs. Please, someone tell me if this is a real creature. It gives me goosebumps to this day, thinking about it, talking about it, and just writing this brought me to tears. Just thinking about it is scary. I'm not that great of a storyteller, but I'll just quickly write what happened. We were staying at Hogan Airbnb on the Navajo Nation close to Monument Valley, and there were several very friendly, calm dogs roaming around. My friends and I, one of whom is deathly afraid of dogs, had no problem being with them or petting them. We had a gorgeous view of Monument Valley right from our door, and it was cold yet cozy. That night I needed to use the bathroom and opened the door to the dogs going absolutely nuts. There is a difference between a dog barking at just whatever, a person walking by for example, and then there was this total fight or flight response. One of the dogs ran up to me, looking anxious and glancing into the desert behind the Hogan. It came close, then walked back to look into the desert behind the Hogan. Its fur stood up and it suddenly looked more like a wolf and took off into the desert at full speed, growling and barking at a huge shadow that ran away from the dog. There aren't many huge animals in the area. Some deer and horses, maybe cattle, but this was bigger. I didn't stick around long enough to check what it was. I was pretty shaken by what I saw. I found some fresh wolf or mountain lion prints and hoof prints, probably from a horse, outside the Hogan the next morning. The dog's prints are smaller. Our host said we might have seen a skinwalker. I'd like to believe it was a horse. It was dark anyhow, but the host didn't want to talk about it too much. The guides we met later on said the same thing and kept it at that. Later that day, one friend suddenly fell ill on a tour of another Hogan and almost fainted. That never happened before in her life. The guide said she probably had some bad spirits attached to her. She recovered quickly after stepping outside. That's all. It was a really wonderful trip overall. I'd go again if I could. This happened 2 times one summer, about 15 years ago, with different people a month apart. First time, I was camping in the woods with my friend and her family. After dinner one night, her uncle started telling us about paranormal experiences he had in his home country. My friend has roots in Southeast Asia. They were creepy tales, and being a lover of horror movies, I was thrilled, to say the least. After story time, my friend's cousins and I, a total of 3, went out ghost hunting. The campground was one of those that had dirt roads, and in between them are trees and the sites for tents and whatnot. We started walking, passing where people were camped, and ended up at the edge of where it was just dark forest. Before we got there, the younger cousin fled back to the campsite due to fear. Me and the remaining cousin laughed as we were both brave, or stupid, teenagers. Anyways, we're walking down the road, looking into the darkness, when all of a sudden, I see this white humanoid thing. And by white, I mean stark white. I described it as fluorescent, which isn't entirely accurate, as it didn't give off light, but it was bright enough to see in the dark. Safe to say, it was spooky. I asked the cousin to shine the light on the thing, but he said he was frozen in fear. Shortly after that, we bolted back to the camp. Now at this point, I could have chalked it up to our minds playing tricks on us after literally going out ghost hunting because we were told ghost stories, which I did for a while. That is, until the next time I saw it. The second time was back in my town, which is about 90 miles away and in the middle of suburbia. This time I was out with 2 friends and we were driving around doing dumb teenager shit. We ended up parking at one of the parks in our town. Now this park is massive. It has a bunch of sports fields, hills, a giant playground, a lake, and even an outdoor amphitheater with big grass steps for seating. We ended up at the top of these grass steps, and we're staring at the sky, enjoying the beautiful starry night. Then, I look down at the stage, which has a building attached for dressing rooms, and I see the white humanoid again, peering out from behind the building. I turn to my friends and ask them if they see it too, and they both say yes. Then we go down to investigate, but find nothing behind the building or in the woods behind it. My friends may have been high, but I was sober. I didn't try to trick them, I just asked them and they both said yes, and looked freaked out. We left after that. I haven't seen this thing since, which is okay by me. I've tried to explain it to myself with the aforementioned doubts, mind playing tricks, high friends, but seeing it on 2 occasions with different people is where I'm stumped. I don't know what it could have been. Also, I never mentioned the first encounter to my friends who were with me during the second encounter, so no power of suggestion there. I recently heard of tall whites, and maybe that was an encounter with them, but the only similarity is the whiteness, as this thing was not particularly tall. Anyways, if anyone can help explain to me what this was, that would be great. I was about 4 years old when I first saw it. My stepfather at the time warned me not to get too close to the trees or it would get me. But I wanted to play outside anyway, so I stepped outside and peered around because the trailer I lived in at the time was right next to a forest. And when I turned to look at the corner that was near the trees, a black, massive thing with yellow eyes peered around the side at me and grabbed the side of the house with inky claws. For years, I asked my mother what it was, because she's no longer with my stepdad, and she doesn't remember anything from the night besides me running inside screaming and crying. My stepfather at the time had no recollection of ever warning me of anything either. Eventually, I forgot about it until 3 years ago. I was sharing a room with a roommate and we were home alone and laughing. I got up to get snacks, but she suddenly stops laughing and says, "Don't go out there. He's waiting for you," which of course struck an intense fear within me. I asked her to repeat what she just said, and immediately she looked confused and said, "I didn't say anything." Obviously I was freaked out and made her leave the room first. Thankfully nothing happened, but As I lived in that apartment, I dreamt about that thing crawling out of my closet and trapping me in my room. I could see it had large antlers and a body of a man, inky claws and rabbit skull for a head. It got to the point where I asked to switch rooms because I thought I was just paranoid about the closet. But then my roommate, when she took over the room, claims she woke up to something standing in the corner watching her. She described the antlers, but for some reason, it didn't bother her, so she stayed in the room. Eventually, I moved to where I live now, and the back of the house is, once again, against a lining of trees. I work third shift, so when I leave for work, every now and then I get a very sickly scared feeling in my gut that it is going to come around the corner, so I run to the car. This feeling happened 2 nights ago, and I don't know what it is, but I'm afraid it's trying to find me, and it's unsettling because hardly anyone takes me seriously about it lately. It doesn't feel like a demon. It feels more than that, more cryptid-like. I've googled anything that might resemble antlers, a rabbit skull, and the body of a man. It also just looks like it dipped itself in a lot of ink and tar. I used to call it the boogeyman, but now I'm not sure. I know it wants to do me harm though. This one takes place in the early 1960s. It happened to my father and his elder sister. He was around 4 or 5 years old, and she was around 12 to 13. This is from my aunt who shared the story. At that time, my father was living with his family, his father, his mother, and his sister, in his native village in Africa, Ivory Coast, West Africa. It is a small village of around 1,500 to 2,000 people. When they are not at school, my father and aunt accompanied their parents to the field. So to explain a bit, in our country, it's not like in Europe or the USA where fields are nearby farms. There, the fields are located far from the villages, sometimes 5 to 10 kilometers in the dense forest. So every morning except Sunday, villagers are walking 2 to 3 hours through the rainforest to reach their fields, work, and at around 4 p.m., they make their way back, again through the forest, to return to the village before nightfall, carrying either food or firewood for cooking, or sometimes both. There is no road, just narrow trails in the forest. It can be scary, but usually it is pretty safe if you take the trails. Sometimes you can meet snakes, foxes, monkeys, large birds, that kind of animal. Before there were elephants and big cats, but no more now because of deforestation and poaching. Well, that day my father and his eldest sister accompanied their father, my grandfather, in the field. Everything went normally as usual. On their way back, since Grandpa was carrying a lot, he walked more slowly. So my aunt and my father, who were just carrying little stuff, walked faster and pulled away from him. My aunt walked in front of my father and they did not speak, eager to get home. The trip went off without a hitch. Suddenly, at one point my aunt had a strange feeling of emptiness behind her. She turned to see that her little brother was not there. Surprised, she started shouting the name of my father. To no answer. She started to panic. Since he was behind her, the only places he could be would be behind her. So she threw her charge and began to run by retracing the steps, while shouting the name of her little brother. For several minutes, she saw nothing. Then at one point, she spotted, several meters in front of her on the trail, what she described as a tiny creature, around 110 to 120 centimeters. And this little creature walked, carrying a little boy on its back. She said that the creature seemed to have its feet positioned upside. She stared, shocked. Then, she shouted loudly to the creature, "Hey you!" to ensure that was what she thought. The creature turned back to my aunt. It was not human, and that was definitely my father on its back. When the creature saw my aunt, it started running, still with my father on its back. My aunt started running too to pursue it. The creature left the trail to get into the dense forest. It was not counting on the determination of my aunt to enter the forest after it. She pursued them throughout the forest for several minutes. Since she was more agile and faster than the creature, which was slowed with its charge on its back, she finally caught up. She lunged at him, screaming, "Give me back my brother! Give me back my brother!" grabbing her brother and pulling him back. The creature also grabbed onto my father. Then, seeing that my aunt was clinging, he let go of my father, who fell to the ground, and the creature vanished before her eyes. My father was groggy and looked dazed. My aunt took him by the hand and they went out of the forest to go home. Once at home, when he regained consciousness, Grandpa and Grandma, my aunt had told them what had happened, asked him how he ended up in the back of this creature. He said he saw no creature. He said he walked behind his sister when the creature appeared to him as the doppelganger of his father. It came from behind and asked him if he was tired and asked him to climb on its back to go home. So he agreed because he thought it was his father. During all this time, and even when his sister was pursuing the creature, he saw himself on the back of his father. My grandpa was 175 centimeters in height, and the creature 110 to 120, until he fell to the ground. The incident did not occur again. They never knew what had happened to kidnap my father. But I know until today, sometimes there are cases of disappearances through the forest, especially children. When I was a little girl and I sometimes went to the fields, we were asked to stay in a group on the trail and not to respond if we heard someone call us in the forest. I want to share my encounter with a humanoid. This is not really an encounter, since the humanoid did not see me, but I think it's interesting anyway. The sighting took place in October 2004 in Abidjan, Ivory Coast. I was spending a few weeks off in my parents' house. The house of my parents was a single-story house with a large garden in the front yard and outbuildings in the backyard. My room was located in the main house with a large window pane that had a view of both the garden and the outbuildings. It was 1 p.m. that day. I was lying in bed just thinking when suddenly something caught my eye to the window. I looked out, thinking I was seeing someone from the house, but to my surprise it was a non-human creature. The creature was rather small, 110 to 120 centimeters in height, very skinny, very thin arms with a big egg-shaped head without visible ears. It had a very nice bright white-blue color and slick skin. It looked like it radiated slightly. Unfortunately, from my position, I only saw its profile and its back. The creature walked past the window quietly and headed towards the backyard. It seemed very at ease, walked calmly and unhurriedly, and knew where it was going. It did not look in my direction. The distance between us was about 4 meters. It disappeared from my sight around the wall that separates the garden and the outbuildings. I was so scared. I stayed still, in the bed so as not to be noticed. There were people in the house that day, but no one seems to have seen this creature. My family recently bought a beautiful but overgrown piece of land in the Kootenays of British Columbia, Canada. It's a wonderful place, but my dad is frustrated with the amount of work they will have to do to live comfortably on our land. I personally love our little pocket of untouched nature, but I'm getting off the topic. I thought it was strange that the previous owners seemed to be in a rush to sell the land, but I chalked it up to the uneven ground and abundance of plants. My family brought their trailer to the land and were staying in it while I set up a small tent nearby since there wasn't enough room for me. Soon after we started staying there, my dad and I were comfortably sitting around the fire pit, stargazing and listening to the sounds of the land, when we started to hear the shrieks of something that was certainly inhuman, but also unlike any animal either of us have ever heard. It was a shrill yet guttural growl that was extremely drawn out and loud. My first guess was that a bear or a cougar got cornered, but listening more closely quickly crushed that assumption. I started to distinguish the growl of a small bear, but that wasn't the source of the strange shriek. It soon started to sound like a bear was cornering something, and the threatened creature was trying to make a last-ditch escape while screaming in pain. Now, I know you're probably thinking it must have been a cougar or something, but I've heard a cougar in a fight before. This was not a cougar. Its shrieks and howls sounded almost demonic. Soon after the noises stopped, my dad and I both decided it would be best to head to bed. While laying in my tent, I started to hear the unmistakable sound of a large creature roaming around our site. After approaching, I heard it settle into place, almost like it was sitting down and getting comfortable. I started to worry that the unidentifiable creature from earlier was stalking me, until I worked up the courage to peek at my tent's window. In the spot I heard the creature approach, I saw not a horrifying monstrosity, but a beautiful black bear. I would normally be afraid upon seeing this, except I made eye contact with the bear and felt an overwhelming sense of safety. I know this sounds crazy, but it almost felt like the bear was watching over us to protect us from something. Soon after noticing the bear, I heard the blood-curdling screech of the unidentifiable creature, much closer now. When the bear heard this, it tensed up, brought itself to its feet and began to growl menacingly. Only a moment after the bear began to growl, I heard a much larger creature than the bear run off in the opposite direction. I swung my head to see where the noise was coming from and got a glance of an incredibly large deer-like animal. I didn't get a good look at it, but I remember seeing thin, skeletal, long pale arms and legs that ended with hooves. But it was also covered in a very dark, blood-like substance, implying that it had been injured recently. When I saw this, my breath caught in my throat, and I couldn't force myself to look away. I saw the trees sway and break where it was running, and then it stopped a far distance away from our land and let out one more shriek. The few birds that were awake in that area flew away in fear, and I shuddered. I looked back at the bear, and it was once again sitting, looking at me with its kind, protective eyes. I've never been more grateful to have a bear living nearby, and no longer fear them, but respect them. This is a story of my encounters with the Brunswick sludge walker. My first experience was May 27th, 2016. The only reason I remember this day is because it was my best friend's birthday. I'm not really sure what time it was, but it had been dark for a couple of hours. I was pretty young around this time, like 13 or so my memory is a bit fuzzy surrounding this experience. My friend had a birthday party that I was attending, and I planned on staying the night. It was just him, another friend, and I staying the night. Shortly after everyone else left, my friend's older brother started telling us about a monster in the woods at Hopkins Park. We didn't really believe him, but he seemed to believe it at least. Eventually, he offered to drive us to the park and go through the woods and prove it to us. Being young kids, never having experienced being somewhere like that unsupervised at night, we eagerly jumped at the chance. We all piled in his little car, and we went to the park. It was like a 10-minute drive, but it went by so fast. We didn't really act excited or anything, but I could tell that we all had the same excitement going on internally. We get to the park, and he parked in the gravel lot. Strangely, there was another car there. We didn't think much of it, but in hindsight, we should have realized that something was up. We got out of the car and my friend pulled out a flashlight. His older brother almost immediately snatched it out of his hands, claiming that since he was the oldest one, he got to use the flashlight, or something like that. After that, we headed straight for some specific path through the woods. Again, this should have seemed suspicious, but we were kids that were just excited to be there. Not long after entering, the flashlight started to flicker and eventually turn off. Again, pretty suspicious. Shortly after that, we heard something walking towards us from the woods. We all froze. It sounded like it stopped right behind us. Then at the same time, my best friend and I both felt a hand on our shoulders. We both screamed and ran out while hearing his brother laughing. Turns out the hand we felt belonged to the older brother's friend, who was in a black morph suit. We felt really dumb for even believing that there was something in the woods, and the older brother and his friend continued to laugh. While they were laughing, we heard this weird howl come from the woods. They froze, but we assumed it was just another prank on their end. They looked mortified, but my two friends and I figured it was another one of their friends in the woods trying to prank us again. Not wanting them to get the pleasure of pranking us again, we headed towards the sound. They tried to stop us, claiming it wasn't them, but we didn't buy it. We trekked through the woods, and we heard the sound once again, but it was much closer this time around. We stopped and looked around, trying to adjust our eyes to our surroundings. I felt a hand on my chest at one point, trying to get my attention. I soon realized what he saw. It was a pair of these glowing orange eyes, easily 10 feet off the ground. We didn't freeze this time. We ran. We found the older brother and his friend, and they didn't believe our experience. They just assumed that it was our attempt to get back at them. But that was simply not the case. We then went back to my friend's house. I didn't sleep that night. Every time I would close my eyes, I would see those eyes. As time went on, the memory faded from my mind. I somehow seemingly forgot that this encounter had even taken place. I think I may have suppressed the memory to keep my sanity. Fast forward a few years and I'm 15. I'm not sure about the date on this one, but it was a weekend in June of 2018. My friends and I would ride bikes around Brunswick, even late at night. Brunswick is a quiet city where you don't need to worry about being out late at night. It's a really safe place, so our parents weren't concerned about us being out late at night. On this particular night, we wanted to go to the playground attached to the school across the street from Hopkins Park. Applewood Elementary, I think it's called. It has this really big blue sign that lights up at night that partially illuminates the area surrounding it. We made it to the park and just hung out on the playground equipment, talking about random stuff. It's also worth mentioning that it was pretty foggy that night, which gave everything an ominous feel. It was pretty cool, actually. The fog around the school was seemingly blue, and that was pretty interesting. Not long after, we became disinterested in what we were doing, and eventually decided on visiting Hopkins Park. There's a pavilion at the center of the park, so we headed there. We sat on the benches and talked for a bit, until we eventually heard a sound coming from the woods. At this moment, I immediately remembered my experience from years earlier. I was mortified. My friends wanted to check it out, but I pleaded with them not to. They then made jokes about me being a baby or whatever, and they somehow persuaded me to go check it out with them. We entered the woods, and we didn't notice much at first. The screeching stopped as we grew closer. I'm not sure why, but this made me even more anxious than I already was. One of my friends wanted to investigate further, so he went off the path and into the dense woods in the direction of where the sound was coming from. We all listened intently as he carelessly trudged through the woods. His footsteps abruptly stopped, and seconds later we heard him scream. We all jumped, but we didn't really move much from where we were. I wanted to go, but my other friends were not going to let that happen. We then saw our friend dash out of the woods, nearly tripping over his own feet. We were too focused on him to notice that something was following him. Soon, we saw the same glowing eyes which I had seen before. It towered over us. It then let out a terrifying screech, a sound like one which would be made in agony. We ran out of the park, leaving our bikes behind. We ended up going to a friend's house who was not with us that night. He lived kind of close to Applewood. His parents were pretty cool and offered to drive us all home. In the morning, I had asked my mum to drive me to the park to get my bike. Naturally, she asked me why I left my bike there. I'm not sure why, but I gave my mum the actual story of what happened. Somehow, she actually believed me. She then told me all about the Hopkins monster, how she didn't encounter it, but she knew plenty of people that did, how there are deer corpses found twisted up in the woods with no signs of them being eaten, how the police are always there at night for some reason. It really stuck with me. My mum was not one to believe in things like Bigfoot or the Loch Ness monster, but she seemed dead set on the existence of this monster. My next encounter was on October 25th, 2019. It was a few days before Halloween, and my friends and I were really into the holiday. We always liked Halloween, but this year was different. We all knew this would be our last real Halloween as kids. I mean, we were all in high school, and we were admittedly a bit too old for trick-or-treating. but we still decided to go one last time. With this in mind, we wanted to make the most out of the month. We spent a lot of time in the woods of parks in our city, hanging out and doing whatever it is teenagers do. Something about the chilly wind and the colourful leaves made being in the woods pretty special. On this particular day, we went to the woods of Hopkins Park after school. The last encounter I had was still in the back of my mind, but I figured nothing would happen while I was there during the day, and I was right. That day was pretty normal, mundane even. We ventured sort of deep into the woods, and it quickly became pretty dense. Soon we all began to smell an incredibly foul stench. Honestly, I've never smelled anything quite as gross as I did that day. It was my best guess as to what a rotting corpse would smell like, and I was sort of right. We walked in the direction of the smell and we found a deer corpse. I've never seen a dead deer up close before, so it was a strange experience. On top of that, its body was twisted up in a strange way, almost unnaturally even. I then realized that it hadn't been touched by any predatory animals, as far as I could tell. I then remembered the conversation I had with my mum about a year earlier. I told my friends about that, and only one of them had ever heard of there being a monster at the park before. We all agreed to come back that night to investigate. I was a bit braver this time around, I suppose. We met up at about 11 o'clock that night at the pavilion. We spent about an hour in the woods to no avail. We expected to find this creature almost immediately, but that was simply not the case. We pretty much gave up, and at this point, I began to doubt my own experiences. We were about to leave when one of my friends went into the woods to pee. Obviously, he went alone. We all waited for him to finish up before leaving and talked while standing around. Suddenly, we heard him fall over and let out a little shout. Right after, we heard a howl from what we could only assume was the monster that dwells within the woods. Then our friend ran out of the woods, moving faster than I've ever seen him run. He had mud on his jeans and what I assumed to be his own piss on his shirt and pants. We followed him as he ran out of the park, all of us being terrified. We tried to figure out exactly what he saw, but he wasn't able to really convey anything worthwhile. Truthfully, I'm not sure he even knows what he saw. Regardless, it really left an impact on him, and he seemed really paranoid for the next few weeks. He didn't even come trick-or-treating with us, which was very unlike him. We would talk to others about this experience, and rarely would they believe us. I certainly understand why they didn't. A few months later, someone suggested that we get a picture of the creature to prove its existence. It was the beginning of winter at this point, so it, theoretically, would be easy to get a picture of the monster as it could not hide behind leaves of trees. Unfortunately, it wasn't snowing a lot around this time. But if it was, that would have been even better, as white snow could contrast against its slick black body. Only one of my friends from the last encounter was willing to go with me to try getting a picture, but that was much better than going alone. This was my final encounter, and it took place on December 14th, 2019. I don't remember the time we were there, but it was past midnight. We ventured into the woods with our phones out, ready to take a picture. We didn't find anything, but we did hear a sound, which we think was caused by it. After hearing that, we eagerly went in the direction of the sound. Unfortunately, we couldn't find it. It was at this point that I started feeling watched. In hindsight, this could have been just paranoia setting in, which would be expected. We kept going through the woods, and as time went on, we both started seeing stuff out of the corners of our eyes. At first, it was minor things like trees moving abnormally, but then it evolved into seeing glowing eyes or even the shape of the creature. The uneasiness we felt began to grow to the point where we felt the need to leave. We were disappointed that we didn't see it, but relieved to finally leave. We put our phones away and headed towards the exit of the woods. Just as we exited the woods, we heard something run towards us. We instinctively ran, and I thought to pull out my phone. Looking behind me as I ran, I took a couple of pictures. Only one was worth viewing, as it was not blurry. The picture I took can be seen on screen now. It was taken pretty close to the gravel lot. This was the last time I went to that park, and I don't think I'll ever go again. I have the proof I wanted of this creature's existence, and that's all I wanted. I feel like this can go without saying, but I don't recommend anyone going to Hopkins Park in Brunswick at night. I live down in Central Texas. It started with a friend of mine, Luke, needing a ride back to town from Houston. He's like family, so I went and brought him on back. He stays kind of near the Dripping Springs area. Before he was in Houston, he and I always heard some strange sounds at night on his property, but we always shrugged it off. He's got livestock, so we often protect them from coyotes and other things. Plus, we normally shoot guns out there, so we don't really worry about what's lurking out there. The night I brought him back, we pulled into his long driveway to head to the house, and along the driveway he has this fire pit about 40 feet away from said road. Down by the pit, from the car, we both noticed 2 blue-bordered, massive yellow eyes in my headlight beams staring straight at us. I said, "Luke, what the F? Do you see that?" As I reached for my flashlight and one of my firearms, and I jumped out of my car window and ran straight to the gleaming eyes. They seemed to blink once and then vanished into the dark. I ran to where I saw it standing and looked all around. The whole FBI flashlight handgun stance. Scanning. I hear footsteps approaching from behind. Startling at first, but these steps were from Luke coming up behind me, yelling, "Watch out, watch out." I turn around to him a few feet away. He'd stopped. He looked confused and looks around. He then said, It was right behind you, and it was waist high." I think to myself, what's waist high and has night vision? Mountain lions? So that's what I thought for a moment. Still, standing in that spot, he says, "We need more gear." So we went to my car. We geared up, killed the engine, then back to the trees. We approached the tree line, aiming the lights to the trees about waist high. Then, I beam my light upwards and see those same eyes dart in a straight line to our left, further into the trees, away from my car and away from his house. Now we're spooked. How is it 9 to 10 feet up in the air or trees without making a single noise? No wing flap, no twigs, footsteps, just dead silence. It's about 2:30 a.m. now. We had been following and going the direction we saw the eyes trail towards, staying very quiet. Suddenly, out of the thicket, about 8 feet in front of me, I see the eyes open within the darkness of the woods. Massive, glowing, and a few inches apart, which made me assume that this creature has size on its side. It stared into me. I stared back. I'm facing this unknown creature at this moment, and I shakily ask, "Luke, are you seeing this?" Not moving my flashlight and not breaking eye contact. I want to know where this thing is, and I want to know if it moves. "I don't, dude. What do you see?" "Luke, are you sure you don't see this?" "I don't. What is it?" I assume the only reason he did not see the eyes is because of my flashlight and my angle with the beam. He was not standing directly in front of the creature, as he was about 6 feet to my right at the moment. So I understand why he couldn't see what I saw due to angle and perspective. After that little back and forth, I see it approach me. It got closer. Hell no. I raised my handgun. I said, "I'm firing," and then fired at this unknown being directly between the eyes. The round I fired stirred up a lot of shit. We heard a very short but low-pitched growl or grunt, followed by what sounded like something very heavy, easily heavier than myself, knocking into a couple of the trees around it. Above, the birds in that tree dispersed. We heard no footsteps, no retreating, and staying there a few moments longer, listening, scanning. We stayed out there, waiting to hear or see anything else for about an hour after that. But the night was quiet and calm afterwards. We go inside, call it a weird day, and go to bed. Next morning, we went to where we spotted and fired. There, we found a bunch of triangle-shaped footprints that led to the fence. We look up. There's a break in the top fencing's wires. Right on the other side of the break, a few limbs and branches had been freshly broken off as they lay on the ground. Some remained dangling and facing the forest floor, like where you would land if you were to jump from the wire break at the top. This is all I have on this story, other than the fact that my friend and I, to this day, still occasionally see those eyes at night, in our dreams and in our windows. My friend and I had been out driving, pretty late, probably 2 a.m. We'd been going at least 70 miles per hour, slowing down because our turn was coming up, so naturally, on this 2-lane road we were leaning towards the right. Suddenly we see something tall, lanky, fast enough to avoid the car. Had to be on its hind legs. It crossed our headlights, coming from right to left, like a swoosh, but it was heading our way, and how fast we had been going, it was conscious enough to avoid us. We couldn't describe it, but the silence and the realization that my friend and I had seen it suddenly hit. We freaked out because the way it happened was so quick, unnatural. We were investigating, deducing everything, but it didn't make any sense. It was no rake, no alien, but something. We couldn't put a finger on it. Now here's where it comes back. My friend and I were talking about it again. We're searching on Reddit because my friend made a clear fact that was seen in this community's bio, which was the description of the creature being 8 feet. When we had seen this figure, she made the exact estimate that it was 8 foot standing, based on my own car's height. This scared us but brought us to the conclusion of what we've seen. It's real. We wished we had a dash cam, but like any other sighting, we only have our own minds. It was August 2016. A close friend of mine had bought 15 acres of woods in central Maine, and they invited me to live on the property in exchange for helping them grow a cannabis garden. I had lived there all summer, and my bedroom was an old, dead school bus that I converted into a cute little house. We had 7 people total on the land, and everyone was hanging out in the community house, a double-wide trailer. They were watching movies and playing board games, and it was only about 9 p.m, but I was tired from work, so I said goodnight and began walking to my bus. It was very, very quiet. The moon was not up yet. I was barefoot with no flashlight, but it wasn't a far walk and I knew I could navigate with my feet. As I passed by the weed garden, I heard a noise like crunch, 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 crunch. The driveway was clear of leaves and brush, so the rustling was definitely the sound of something stepping out from the woods and directly into my path. For a half a second, I thought it was an animal, but my stomach formed a knot when I realized that the steps had sounded distinctly biped. My eyes had been looking at my feet, but they shot upwards when they heard the noise. Before me stood the creature. I don't remember seeing its legs, probably because my eyes shut up so fast and I was so stunned. It was maybe 6 feet in front of me, and it stood about 7 feet tall. When my eyes shut up, I was facing its chest, and I had to raise my eyes higher to see its face. When I saw the face, I had the wind completely knocked out of me. The creature was whitish, not glowing, but its skin looked exactly like pale skin under moonlight. Remember though, the moon had not risen yet. The form was pretty humanoid, but very tall and skinny. It had no clothing. I saw a bare chest, slender arms, and the shape of a head. I don't remember ears. I remember holding its gaze for a moment, searching for eyes and seeing nothing. No distinguished eyes, face, or mouth. But the face definitely had ridges and contour. I think maybe it did have facial features, but they were so subtle or sunken in that I couldn't make them out. Anyways, the sight of its face knocked the wind out of me. My eyes fell to the ground. They felt forced to the ground. I couldn't bear to look at it. It stood perfectly still while I gasped for air for a moment. I wanted to scream, but I had no air. I felt so paralyzed with fear. I took a moment to do a deep inhale and a deep exhale. I looked at its face again. It still stood, motionless, watching me. I then turned on my heel and ran back to the community house as fast as I could, screaming all the way. My friends suggested that perhaps I had come face to face with a person who was scoping out the weed garden to steal from it. This is common here, and the garden was flowering, so it was really smelly. The locals had definitely noticed. The part I can't answer, though, is why would a robber walk right up to me? I don't know. I consider myself a skeptic, and I think it's possible that my mind was playing tricks on me. But then again, I've never been afraid of the dark or anything like that. I told my friend this story, and he said I should share it here. If you have any questions, feel free to ask. This was probably the strangest experience of my entire life. And to be honest, it haunts me. These days, I am afraid of the dark. First of all, growing up, I've dealt with paranormal things like shadow people, things moving without anyone touching them, etc. And I swear, this is a legit story. A year ago in May, in 2020, my parents were going on their annual trip to Florida with my 3 brothers for the week. My mother asked me if I could go by their house and feed the family's dogs or stay and house sit. Being the daughter I am, I told my mother I would just stay at the house to save on gas. Throughout the week at night, I would bring the 2 dogs inside to feel safer since my parents live on a somewhat back road. Keep in mind, my parents' house is surrounded by trees, and there is a thick tree line separating their house from the 2 neighbors. Well, one night, while I was at the house alone, I had called my best friend, Bailey, to come over and stay the night. We were going to do what 2 mid-20-year-old females do when alone: play video games, watch movies, TikToks, and drink a little. While Bailey and I were in the kitchen, around 3 or 4 a.m., making homemade funnel cakes like the fat asses we are, the dogs kept moving around and staring at the glass kitchen door that led off to the back porch. I asked Bailey to let them out there so they could chill and we would have enough legroom while we were cooking. While we were eating our funnel cakes, we came across a TikTok about making homemade temporary tattoos with a printed picture and perfume. Now keep in mind, my parents have about 3.82 acres of land, and there is the family house, my father's 2-door garage workshop, and a large pole barn. Those 2 buildings are further out, near the tree line. So Bailey and I walked down to the workshop to get into my parents' work office. I punch in the code to the garage door, and we go inside, straight to the computer, and print each other a picture of Kylo Ren to try and make into temporary tattoos for each other. Before I go any further, a little side note. My parents have security cameras all around their property, and inside the office is a television above the desk, showing all of the live footage from the cameras. So while I was cutting out the tattoo for Bailey, she says, "What is that?" I stop cutting and look up at the cameras. At first, I didn't see anything except for a small figure in front of the pole barn. It looked like it was sniffing at the garage door. I shrugged it off and told her it was probably one of the many stray dogs that roamed around the area. Bailey nudged my arm quickly after I said that and pointed to the screen again. Wanting to prove to her that it was just a stray dog, I stood up and looked closer to the screen. And when I did, I saw the figure, but it didn't look like one of the small dogs. The creature was hunched over on all 4s. Its arms were super thin and long, but pointing outwards from its chest. Kinda like how you'd imagine that girl from The Exorcism to be when she crawled on all 4s. It had no fur. Its skin looked tight on its body. On instinct, I went to open the door to look at it, but Bailey stopped me right when I grabbed the lock on the door. Looking back at the screen, at the creature, it looked like it scratched at the door of the pole barn. I immediately said, "What the hell is that?" And the creature turned its head straight at the camera, like it was a scene from The Office. When its head turned, I couldn't make out clear facial features, but it looked like it had a human head with two big glowing eyes. Bailey and I screamed and it bolted, and I mean bolted off screen. Clearly freaked out, Bailey and I hugged each other like that would protect us. Then, something smashed against the garage door, not once but twice. Like, you know what it sounds like for someone to smack a garage door from the outside with their hand? Yeah, just like that. I called my grandmother and told her that we thought we saw something, and to stay on the phone with us until we ran into the house. Once we got into the house, we brought the dogs in, locked every single door, and took shots of Crown until we fell asleep. Now, we talked about this a few times, and I think it was a Wendigo, but Bailey thinks it was a Skinwalker. But now people on Reddit are saying it was probably a crawler. Thoughts, anyone? The first experience I had, I took one of my buddies up to the San Isabel National Forest, which I've been through many times before in the day. We drove out there around 9 p.m. and rode some trails out to the heart of the forest, looking for skinwalkers. But really, I was just screwing with him and going for a trail ride. At the turnaround point, I got the cliche feeling of being watched, but was driving with my backup camera on the whole time. The trail was a bit dusty, but I started to notice an almost man-like shape running behind the vehicle from a distance. I didn't see anything at first because I thought maybe it's just me. So I stopped for a minute and asked my friend if he saw anything in the camera, and he described the same thing. We rolled down the windows and listened for any movement outside. With nobody else in the 250 square mile forest, we simultaneously heard a little boy, maybe 5 or 6 years old, cry out, "Help!" and our heads snapped towards each other, and my friend said, "Just drive." We kept moving back on the trail and seeing the thing in my camera standing as tall as the spare 35-inch tire on my lifted Jeep while running on all fours. When we got to a fork in the trail that turns back the way we came, I decided to turn and head back because I was curious and wanted a definitive interaction. My buddy wasn't interested in proving there was bad shit in these woods, but I was driving. After a few minutes, he starts groaning loud like he was hurt and covering his face. When I ask him what's wrong, I get hit with a sensation of absolute dread and sensory overload. When I was younger, I practiced black magic, and I can say with absolute certainty that it felt like a demonic presence. My eyes were tearing uncontrollably, and I could hardly breathe or speak. At which point I turned around on the trail, and we left for good, still with a clear humanoid shape tailing us out of the woods. He later told me he heard something make a noise outside his window that started like a low gurgling but raised to a loud scream, just like a howler monkey. I never heard anything, but the sensation was overbearing and physically crippling. After getting back on the road and stopping for gas, we found muddy handprints on the rock guards and tire gate of my Jeep. It was spotless before leaving. The second encounter happened a few weeks later. I took some more friends out there, minus the one from the first trip, on what you could call an armed expedition. I was definitely disappointed in their tactical proficiency and weapon handling, considering we were all soldiers, but these were the only people willing to do this with me. There were 5 of us this time, and we were armed with 2 rifles, a 12 gauge, and sidearms. After driving down the same trail and having a few odd experiences, such as hearing movement in the dark, glowing red eyes, and some heard singing, we decided to dismount and walk a footpath. This is around October, and early for snow, but of course, as we get out of the vehicle, it starts snowing, almost a whiteout. Maybe 50 meters down the trail, we hear the movement of something really big on our right side in the trees, and to me, sounded like it could only be a moose. One of the guys finds a stick teepee off the trail, and we checked it out for a bit. There were some weird bundles of sticks tied to the tree branches, but we kept moving. The one guy in our group who wasn't convinced and thought these creatures were bullshit tries to be Mr. Hardass and walked ahead of the group with just my 12 gauge and no flashlight. When I hear that movement in the woods again, I call everyone into a circle in case we got charged by a bull moose. He starts yelling, "WTF is that? Give me some light." And we shine a handheld spotlight in the direction he's holding his shotgun. He tells us to go back right now and hurry, never lowering his weapon. I pretty much had to herd him back, watching all directions, and a few times situating ourselves for a confrontation as we heard noises and more movement of something tearing through the trees, circling us from multiple directions. When we made it out of the woods and began mounting back up in the Jeep, he told me that he saw this big, pale, skinny creature just sitting there ahead of us on the trail. He said it had some thin, scraggly hair on its head, and he thought it was a log till it turned its head and looked at him in the light. We heard a few faint screams from the woods before departing. After these two incidents, I took a few more trips out there in similar armed groups. But aside from similar noises and others, like the sound of chains jingling and some responses to our whistling, there were no other interactions. When I would whistle, the woods nearby would whistle back. I want to continue studying these creatures, though I'm back in Florida now. I'm hoping to find some here, as I've read on Reddit that there are encounters in Florida. If anyone has any insight or experiences, please feel free to share them. I've never posted a story like this, so I apologize if I'm not a good storyteller or something. But this is just a recount from about 8 months ago.
I remember when I was 13, I was obsessed with Indiana Jones. I was obsessed with the concept of adventure and finding hidden treasure. In order to fill that need, I would go in my backyard and explore the woods. The woods went on what felt like forever. It was always one of my goals as a child to explore all the way through the woods and into the next town. The next town over was named Jonesboro, and it happened to be about 7 miles away. I hiked what felt like an uneventful couple of hours, much deeper than I'd ever been before. Being so young at the time, I had yet to notice that it was getting later in the day. It wasn't getting darker, so it didn't faze me. I soon came across something that struck me as odd. I could see through the trees a good distance away what appeared to be a barn out in the middle of the woods. My brain tingled with adventure as I saw other buildings appear the closer I walked. The red barn stuck out like a sore thumb out in the middle of the dark woods. The other small structures were painted different colors and were different shapes. It looked like an old town, however it was scaled down to the size for children. I could tell from a distance that there were people there, however. I somehow knew that this wasn't Jonesboro. Maybe there was some smaller town in between the town I was living in and Jonesboro. However, why would it be out in the middle of the woods? Why weren't there any streets that led out here? I was confused. I walked over to one of the buildings and looked around the makeshift town. I didn't pay much attention to the people that were randomly scattered throughout the area, since my mind was still trying to process what I was looking at. At first, I wasn't afraid, but rather filled with excitement. as it would appear that I discovered a secret town out in the middle of the woods. Every adventurer's dream. However, my delight did not last long as I noticed one of the people staring at me with an unsettling gaze. They were standing a bit away from me, so their features weren't nearly as clear, but it seemed that they were frozen. The person staring continued to look at me, but didn't move. I wasn't sure what to do, but like any good explorer, I came in closer to see what was going on. The buildings were about a dozen or so, and they all seemed to be in various stages of age. Some looked older, while others seemed more new. I ignored the person that was staring at me, and I walked into the town to see other people in random poses. As I saw the other people, I then noticed that none of them had moved since I first saw the town. I then realized that the town was filled with these lifelike mannequins. Their features were indistinguishable at a distance, and now seeing that they were not people, this gave me an uneasy feeling. I decided to go into one of the buildings to see the extent of this out-of-place creation. The building, despite being small, was oddly outfitted to look and function like any other building that actual people might use. However, none of the lights worked inside. I then saw one of the mannequins much closer this time, and my brain began to slowly realize something horrifying. The mannequin had black streaks running down its face from its eyes, which appeared to be empty and hollow. This mannequin had an old leathery exterior that appeared to be worn and weathered by time. The eyes were hollow, however, they somehow kept their gaze on me as I continued to examine the oddity that laid before me. Even more disturbing than the eyes was the smile that appeared to be torn, but also stitched on its face, forcing this hideous expression of an exaggerated smile. I had seen enough. I was clearly somewhere where I wasn't supposed to be. I began making my way out of the small-shaped shed when I thought I heard something outside. If it was anyone who had anything to do with these creepy lifelike mannequins, then I wanted nothing to do with them. I decided that it would be best to hide and hope that whoever it was would pass. I stood quietly as the sound got louder, and I could hear what sounded like someone dragging something heavy. I peeked outside, ever so briefly to see what would be out there, but my quick peek quickly became long as I saw what looked like a pale creature dragging a person. The creature was long despite crawling on all fours. I didn't get a great look at its face, but I could see that it had a full mouth of sharp teeth with the same exaggerated smile as the mannequins. The person lay lifeless as a tall humanoid-like creature continued to drag them inside of one of the small buildings. It finally dawned on me that these mannequins were not these incredibly detailed dolls, but rather people that had been stuffed and placed around this makeshift town. I could only assume that the creature purposely tore and stitched those horrible smiles to replicate itself, almost as if it was making itself these morbid friends it could play with. I reached into my back pocket and pulled out my glow-in-the-dark handled butterfly knife that was more for show than anything. I opened it and held it, pointing the tip downwards as I tried to slowly move out of the small building. I noticed the floors creaked much louder now that I was trying to be quiet. I wasn't sure what the creature's abilities were, or if it could even hear, but I assumed that stealth would be my key on getting out of here alive. It was soon clear that hearing was something it could definitely do. I placed my hand on my face as I held back my terrified breathing as the creature emerged from the small building and cocked its head, as if it was trying to listen. It stood upright, revealing its true height to be around 8 feet tall. The sun was getting much lower now, and the visibility was getting worse by the minute. The longer I was out here, the worse things were going to get. The creature then went back on all fours and started to inspect each building. I had no choice but to make a break for it, as it entered one of the furthest buildings away. Instead of sprinting full blast, I tiptoed out of the building and headed back the way I thought I came. I instantly knew that this was a mistake. I could hear the creature thrash around the furthest building. I sprinted through the woods in the direction I could only wish to be home. The sounds of the creature were still back at the small town, as if it was trying to figure out which way I went. It didn't take long for it to figure out where I was, as I could clearly hear labored breathing not too far behind me. At this point, I had regretted going so far into the woods, especially so late in the day. The sun at this point was now setting, but there was still a little bit of a dull glow in the distance. I was hitting low-hanging tree limbs and branches, trying my best not to trip on anything. I knew that if I had fallen, I was definitely dead. The sounds behind me were so loud that I knew it could definitely see me. I didn't glance backwards, not even once. It seemed to be screeching now, not because it was afraid or angry, but I think it was more out of excitement. The next thing I know, I'd been tackled to the ground. The tackle had knocked the wind out of me and also knocked my knife out of my hand. The creature's screeching began to sound different, as if it had suddenly caused itself great pain. I laid on the ground trying to get my breath back, as I could see my glowing butterfly knife had inadvertently made its way into the creature's ribcage. The screeching slowly morphed into sobbing and whimpering. It flailed around as I finally regained my breath. I got up and staggered my way home as the creature's sobs slowly faded behind me. I made it back home in about an hour, having jogged the whole time. I was exhausted and sore from running in the tackle. I told my parents immediately what I saw, and thankfully, they actually believed me. We called the police and made a report. They weren't able to come out until the next day. The police showed up early the next morning, and I told them where it was in the woods. They asked me to guide it to them, and I somehow mustered the courage to do it. The hike was longer the second time, and I was half expecting the small town to have disappeared, but sure enough, it was still there. The human dolls were still placed across the town, and it didn't take long for the police to identify most of them as missing people in the last 6 months. Even having shown the police the small town and all the dead people, they still found the part about the creature to be difficult to believe. I don't really care if they believe me or not. I told the truth, and there was not much more I could really do. The hike back with the police was relieving. I knew I wasn't crazy, and people actually believed me. I felt that this nightmare was now behind me, and this huge weight was lifted off my chest. That was until, however, when we got back to my backyard. As we exited the tree line, something caught my eye. It laid in the grass not too far away, but I immediately recognized it. It was my butterfly knife. Not only did the creature follow me, but it knew where I lived.
Hello watchers and listeners, thank you so much for watching. As always, a big thank you to all of the Reddit users who kindly allowed me to use their stories. If you want to help support this channel, you will find links to both my Patreon and my Teespring store in the description below, so feel free to have a look. And the biggest thank you to all of you who continue to support me. I truly do appreciate it. And remember,
Papa loves you.